Hey everyone, welcome to another video by your favorite Delver of Brews. In this video I'm going to be covering permission spells, mostly centered around Modern, though a lot of these spells see play in other formats, and I'll be making some references to Legacy as well, just to contrast some of the slightly more powerful permission spells that we find in that format. So stick tight if you are new to Blue or playing Blue decks, or if you just want to hear my thoughts on these different counter spells and how I would use them or how I would play them or not play them. Stay tuned for that. Before I do, just a quick note here. If you're not a patron already, check out the link in the description of this video. Check out my Patreon. My Patreon is not made for me to make money. It's made actually for you to make money. And if you want to find out more, click the link in the description. There's a video there that describes everything in about 5 minutes. And yeah, I would like to see you join the ranks of the ever-growing Delver Brews Patreon community. All right, let's go. So this video was inspired by the recent printing of Counterspell, or reprinting, I should say, of Counterspell in Modern Horizons 2, which now makes it legal in the best 60 card format in the game, Modern. And I just wanted to start off with, I think, with Counterspell. Counterspell is probably a good place to start off here for 2 blue counter target spell. This is the best rate you're ever going to get on a Counterspell. And by that I mean without having to sacrifice something else. Just paying hard mana, nothing else, no life, no discarding of spells or cards in your hand or whatever. Just counter target spell, any spell. 2 blue. This is the best you're ever going to get. Modern finally has it. Now, is it the most efficient? No, and we'll see that as we get to other permission spells in this video. But it is a very powerful addition to Modern. And I'm just super excited that it is, it's an option that we can now have. Now, before Counterspell, we had Mana Leak and we had Remand in the counter spot. And there's a few other cards I'll get to, but Mana Leak in particular was basically the closest we had to, a pay 2 counter target spell in Modern. Now, obviously, there's a condition on Mana Leak, which is your opponent can pay 3 mana and get around the counter. But in the early game turns 2, 3, and 4, Mana Leak kind of acts as a counterspell because essentially most spells cast in the first few turns, assuming your opponent is not ramping on mana, this will act essentially as a counterspell. After that, though, as the games progress, Mana Leak's stock essentially drops and it becomes less and less effective. So that's really where, a lot of control decks, they kind of fell short, because late in the game you would have to rely on Cryptic Command, for example, to be your hard counter, but paying 4 mana for that is, it's very dangerous late game. So now we have an upgrade counterspell. Now, decks also played Remand, and they still will. A lot of decks will still play Remand in some numbers, mostly because those decks are banking on card advantage, and they're probably just, delaying your spell, for a turn or two so they can do something else and win the game. And the ability to draw a card here, so the fact that it cantrips is important. So I still think Remand is going to see some level of play in certain decks. When I do see Remand in a deck, I'm kind of suspicious, because that means they're probably up to no good. They're doing something that's not necessarily on the level. So if you ever do get your spell remanded, keep that in mind, especially now that we do have Counterspell in Modern. If they're playing Remand over Counterspell, then there's something else is up. So just, keep your eyes peeled for that. Now, obviously, there is one downside to Counterspell, and that's the fact that it's double blue. So double blue does make it a bit more difficult to cast in, let's say, a 3-color deck. Now, that's just goes without saying here. So this is something that, if you are playing a 3-color deck, you're going to have to adjust your mana base a bit to ensure that you get double blue early in the game, or else you're going to find yourself in a bit of trouble. And as a teamer player, I can tell you, I've had to make some minor adjustments to make sure that I have, more access to blue, and that means potentially playing extra shock lands, which also means you might be hurting yourself a bit more early game if you start off with Counterspell in your opening hand. So that's something you're going to have to keep in mind. And also mid to late game, Mana Leak gave you the ability to use your mana a bit more freely, and just make sure you have 1 blue and 1 of any other color open. And now the fact that we're replacing Mana Leak in most decks with Counterspell means no, it's going to be way more restrictive. So you're always going to want to make sure that most of your lands, if not all of your lands, or at least your lands for the first 2 to 3 land drops, all can produce blue. That's really going to be important. That's something that I am still adjusting to. So that's really the major downside of Counterspell here, is the double blue makes a huge difference in a lot of decks. Now, if you're playing a mono blue deck, or a blue red deck, or a blue green deck, whatever it is, if you're just playing 2 colors or 1 color, that's not really a problem for you, right? It really starts getting, you can really start to feel the effects once you start to add a 3rd color. And obviously 4 color and 5 color decks, that's going to be pretty brutal. I guess some decks could do it, but it's going to be very hard. So there is some deck building restrictions around Counterspell, which is why I also think it's a perfectly fine addition to Modern. I'm looking forward to seeing more of it. Although I am not looking forward to having it played against me, but I know it's in the format now, and it is what it is. I think this is a great upgrade to the format. Now, there was one more card that would see fringe play in Modern, and I've played with Deprive quite a bit in the past. I would say 2016, 2017 era Modern. I would play certain Delver decks with Deprive in it. Now, Deprive was the closest you got to Counterspell, essentially, before Counterspell was legal in Modern. So let's quickly read it here. As an additional cost to cast Deprive, return a land you control to its owner's hand. Counter target spell. So, you better be countering a really, really strong spell, because it's pushing you back essentially 1 land drop. And that is kind of problematic, because if you do this on turn 2, well, you're countering a spell, but you're also pushing yourself back a turn, essentially, in terms of mana. So there's a huge drop back to Deprive. And although I did see it in lists here and there, the fact that Counterspell is now legal means Deprive is gone forever, which is too bad, because I always liked Deprive deep down inside. I always thought it was a cool card, but I also thought it was a cool card because it would counter target spell, and now we just have Counterspell. So goodbye, Deprive. F in the comment section down below, please. Speaking of mana leak, though, there are a few other cards here that, have a mana leak-like effect. So mana leak is just, it's always going to be the same thing. 1 blue, 1 colorless, counter target spell unless it's controlled, pays 3. Cool. Logic Knot, which sees plenty of play in Modern, and it is actually a spell that I hate. I hate only because I rarely play with it, because if I'm delving, I want to be delving for creatures, just personally. And it's super hard to work around. Unless you have a hard counter for Logic Knot, your opponent is almost always going to delve for like 5 or something, and just in case you produce mana out of nowhere, and you're never going to be able to pay the cost. So it essentially acts as a hard counter. So for 2 blue and X, delve, counter target spell unless it's controlled, pays X. Now, in theory, you could just pay 1. It really depends on how much mana your opponent has open. So it could act as like a cancel, more or less. But, it is relatively powerful in decks that are pretty interactive. It's an option that you might have if you have no other use for your graveyard in your blue deck. Or if you have few other uses for your graveyard, then this is actually a pretty great card to play. Is it better than Counterspell now that Counterspell is legal? I don't know. I feel like I would prioritize Counterspell over this, especially since there's a double blue already in the cost. So you're going to have to pay the double blue anyway. I think I would rather just play Counterspell at that point. So very few instances do I think Logic Knot now makes more sense than Counterspell, but we'll see how the meta shapes up. Some people might just still want to play it, but I don't see the point. Mystical Dispute, counter target spell unless it's controlled, pays 3, so very much a mana leak like effect. Its base cost is 3 mana, so it's definitely worse than mana leak, except that there's a cost reduction ability on it. So this spell costs 2 less to cast if it targets a blue spell. So Mystical Dispute often sees a lot of play in sideboards, and it's brought in against other blue decks. So if you don't have access to green, for example, so if you can't play Veil of Summer, you'll play Mystical Dispute instead, and it acts as a 1 mana leak, which actually is pretty powerful. There's really nothing else like it in Magic, I believe, or at least definitely legal in Modern, that has that kind of rate for 1 mana. So pretty powerful if you are targeting blue spells, and that's really what you're going to be bringing it in for anyway. So let's move on here. There are some permission spells that we have that target any spell, as long as it has a specific converted mana cost. Spell Snare sees plenty of play. Personally, I never really enjoyed playing Spell Snare in my deck, even though I know Spell Snare is a good card. Counter target spell with converted mana cost 2. In Modern, there are so many spells that cost 2. So early in the game, this is pretty backbreaking for 1 mana, very, very mana efficient for what it does. Counter target, you're going to counter their spell on turn 2 or turn 3. Very, very good. I just never liked Spell Snare because its stock again dropped pretty dramatically as the game progresses. And although your opponent may always have a 2 mana spell somewhere, you're just always going to be hoping for a 2 mana spell. And too many times was I caught, with Spell Snare in my hand, and my opponent's casting 1 mana spells and 3 mana spells and 4 mana spells and nothing else. So this is why I mostly stay away from Spell Snare. But again, probably more a preference than an indictment of the card, because again, it sees plenty of play in a lot of control decks. I think if you're playing a dedicated control deck, so if you're not playing tempo or anything else, you're just there to lock out the game for as long as possible and then winning with like a Snapcaster Mage or something, Spell Storm probably makes a lot more sense in a deck like that. Disdainful Stroke sees a lot more play in the sideboard. I played with it plenty of times in the sideboard. Counter target spell with converted mana cost 4 or greater. You're usually bringing this in for, let's say, Tron decks, or you're bringing it in against other control decks that might be playing Cryptic Commands and other 4 mana spells, or any deck where you're worried about 4 or greater. So this also applies to combo decks, where a lot of the combo pieces are usually 4+ mana. For example, if you were talking about Primeval Titan, this becomes a hard counter for Primeval Titan, as opposed to Mana Leak, where usually in primetime decks they'll have the extra mana somewhere to pay for Mana Leak. Here this is more of a hard counter. So Disdainful Stroke, I think again its stock has dropped recently in light of better options, but I still think it has viability depending on what the current meta is. So yeah, it's a permission spell to keep in mind. Definitely not something you would play in the main board though. So yeah. All right, what about pitch spells? Now I personally love permission pitch spells, and before we had the artwork that's in the center of the screen right now that's currently blurred, we had Disrupting Shoal. Now, I've played many Disrupting Shoal in Modern, especially in my Temur Delver decks, and when it was all we had, Disrupting Shoal was great. And when the format was very linear, again, Disrupting Shoal was great. You had a lot of 1, 2, and sometimes 3 mana spells in your deck, and with Disrupting Shoal, you could essentially counter most spells that most decks were casting, especially in the early game, and you could always tap out. So you could always tap out, do what you want to do, and you would feel relatively confident with Disrupting Shoal in your hand and a few other blue spells that were either 1 or 2 mana, and you were ready for almost anything in the early game, and you knew you were going to be able to counter any problem. So Disrupting Shoal, aside from its many, its limitations, being, you have to build your deck around it, you have to have enough blue spells, they have to have varying range of CMC, and you have to hope that you have those CMCs in your hand. It was really the best that we had. And of course, late game, you could always just hard cast it to blue and X to target any spell as well. I've done that here and there, but it really shined in the early game. Now, then came along Force of Negation. And if you look at the cost of Disrupting Shoal, money-wise, and you look at the cost of Force of Negation, yeah, there's a reason why there's a vast difference in terms of cost in buying these cards. And this is because Force of Negation is just better in almost every way. The real downside here is the fact that Force of Negation only targets non-creature spells, and it's only free or it can only be cast for free if it's not your turn. So if it's your turn, it's a problem because, if you're casting a creature and your opponent's trying to counter it, Force of Negation is going to be useless to you unless you have, 5-6 mana open, which is, if you have 5-6 mana open, I think things are going relatively well, potentially, anyway. But yeah, Force of Negation, in every other scenario, though, is a very, very powerful card. A lot of the, problematic spells that you want to be countering are non-creature spells anyway, most of the time. So the fact that Force of Negation is countering just non-creature spells is a relatively okay restriction. The fact that you can do it for free and then it just requires any blue card from your hand and not a specific type of CMC blue card or a specific type of blue card really makes Force of Negation, it's extremely powerful. In every deck that I've played recently or ever since it's been legal in Modern, I think Force of Negation has always been a 4 of maybe a 3 of. But I really love Force. Some decks play 4 Force Negations and some number of Disrupting Shoals as well. That's perfectly fine, because Disrupting Shoal does have the ability to A, counter spells on your turn, and B, counter creature spells, which can also be relevant, but Force of Negation is always going to take precedence over Disrupting Shoal. Recently, and by recently I mean like now, we had Subtlety printed, a card that never existed before. It's, if you want to cast it, legally or fairly, you're going to be paying 2 blue and 2 colorless. It has flash and flying, and it's a 3/3, which is fine. What's really interesting here is that it has an effect. When Subtlety enters the battlefield, choose up to 1 target creature spell or planeswalker spell. Its owner puts it on the top or bottom of their library, and you could cast it for free, in quotation marks, by evoking it. So you could exile a blue card from your hand, it enters the battlefield, and then it gets exiled immediately. I'm still on the fence about Subtlety. Subtlety is a very powerful card. It's a pitch spell for all intents and purposes, like Force of Negation and Disrupting Shoal. It has a very specific target, creature spell or planeswalker spell. For me, that really narrows it down. Although I believe if this targeted any spell, it's probably broken. I probably have to think about that a bit more. But the fact that it's limited to just creature and planeswalker spells means it becomes very narrow. So I'm still trying to process, and I think the meta still has to play out. I'm still trying to process where Subtlety will fit in a deck. Now, when it was first spoiled, I read it and I'm like, what? This is insane. I think every blue mage kind of blew up, their minds exploded. But then you start reading the card over and over and over again, and you start realizing, okay, well, actually, no, there's some limitations. Okay, no, well, actually, which cards am I really want to target here that are really problematic that I can't already deal with my decks? And then, okay, now the opponent chooses if it goes on the top or the bottom, so it's their choice, it's not ours. So that, if they really need that card, it's going to come back in a turn or two. So there's a lot more downsides as you go through the different scenarios where you would want to have Subtlety in your deck. But I think as a 2 of right now, to test it out and to see where it all fits, I think it's going to be good. It might be good in mono blue decks or decks that are of just blue and another color, where their access to certain types of removal may be limited, where Subtlety might make a lot more sense. So, again, it's really going to be a very edge case scenario for me. I don't think it's going to be a sideboard card, but it really depends on how it performs. It may very well become relegated to the sideboard, but we'll see where it goes. And we're going to cover some other permission spells really soon that remind me of Subtlety, and they have their own narrow limitations. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't go over 2 other cards. If I didn't go over 2 other cards here that are not legal in Modern, but are, if not equally, way more powerful in terms of power level. There's Force of Will and Daze. So these are obviously legal in Legacy and Vintage. Force of Will, obviously, I don't think many people ever cast a hard cast of Force of Will. It's possible. I mean, when I did play with Force of Will, I don't think I ever hard cast it. I always exiled a blue card from my hand and paid a life, but counter target spell. Simple as that. I mean, look at Disrupting Shoal, look at Force of Negation, look at the limitations on those cards and what they target, what they can target. Force of Will just targets any spell, and all you got to do is pay a life and exile a blue card from your hand. So you're already exiling blue cards with Force of Negation, Disrupting Shoal. Obviously, Force of Will just goes one step further with 1 life and target any spell you want. Super, super powerful. This card can't exist in Modern, I don't think. No, it can't. It'd be nice, actually. I mean, we're probably going to slowly get there as power creep goes on. But for now, I think Force of Will is a step too far in Modern. But in Legacy and Vintage, it's a pillar of the format. It keeps those formats in check. Daze is also a very problematic card, even in Legacy. Now, Daze, you may return an island you control to its owner's hand rather than play Daze's mana cost. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. So early in the game, Daze is brutal. Being able to counter a spell turn 1 on your opponent, especially in Legacy, for example, is a super powerful play. When I used to play Legacy Merfolk, I had Force of Will and Daze in my deck, and very much needed. They're very powerful turn 1 plays. Sometimes if you're even targeting a Brainstorm, it's enough to kind of slow down your opponent. So Daze, very, very powerful. Again, it allows you to tap out like Force of Will and all of the spells that you see on the screen, so that you could tap out, do whatever you want to do, and still be able to counter a spell on your opponent's turn or even on your turn. So I just wanted to point out Force of Will and Daze, show you their power level compared to what we have in Modern. We're not that far off, but the small differences make a big difference. Let's just put it that way. Now there's another spell that's technically free, and that's Pact of Negation. Counter target spell. That's pretty powerful for 0 mana. Wow, counter target spell. At the beginning of your next upkeep, pay 2 blue and 3 colors. If you don't, you lose the game. Plenty of people have lost games because they forgot to pay it. Generally speaking, Pact of, I think I've played at least 1 or 2 games where my opponent forgot the trigger, or they forgot the trigger, and then I called them. They lost the game. Hey, this is a tournament. I'm not going to help you out. But yeah, Pact of Negation is a type of card you're going to play in a combo deck. Let's just be honest. This is often a card that you're going to cast where you have no intentions of paying that 2 blue and 3 colorless. You just plan on casting it, countering whatever you need to counter so that you can continue with your combo, and then that's that. You don't have to worry about the next turn because there's gonna be no next turn. There's also, there are also sequences where you cast a Pact of Negation, and at the beginning of your next turn, you play a card like Angel's Grace, which says you can't lose the game this turn. And because you can't lose the game this turn, you could choose not to pay, the 5 mana, and you still can't lose because Angel's Grace resolved. And there's a few other cards that do that. You don't really see that much anymore, but you used to see that with a few combo decks in the past. So I just wanted to bring up Pact of Negation. I still see it here and there in some decks. It doesn't see that much play anymore. Okay, let's shift here a bit because a lot of the spells we've covered so far are counter target spell, and there's some downside. Those are pretty wide. Those are far reaching. They target a lot of spells, but there's plenty of spells in Modern and in the game that target specific types of spells, in particular non-creature spells. So Force of Negation targets non-creature spells as well, but that's a different level. That's a pitch spell. So these are not pitch spells. These are spells that you're going to pay full mana for all the time. And let's go through each one really quickly and see where you would use it. So Spell Pierce sees play here and there, and honestly it's so annoying because I never see it coming. I know this card exists in Modern and I've played it myself, but I never see Spell Pierce coming, and it's super annoying because it gets you. It really gets you, and you feel confident that you're casting a non-creature spell, and then boom, your opponent out of nowhere casts Spell Pierce, and yeah, you're screwed. So Spell Pierce, very similar to Mana Leak, almost. So you're paying 1 blue as opposed to a blue and a colorless. Okay, that sounds good. Your opponent only has to pay 2 as opposed to 3. Fine. And you're targeting a non-creature spell. But again, when you're playing a deck and you have Spell Pierce in it, you are using it, in a very calculated way. You're not playing it in a deck that's, you're usually not playing Spell Pierce in like a mid-range deck or even in a control deck. You're playing Spell Pierce in a deck that doesn't plan on playing very long. It is being very nimble with its mana because it has to do very specific things, like a combo deck, let's be honest. And you're using Spell Pierce so that you can do what you need to do, and in case your opponent tries to stop you, you have a Spell Pierce to ideally stop them early in the game. Because again, Spell Pierce loses its power very rapidly as the game evolves and as your opponents start to get more mana on more land on the battlefield. Well, then they're going to be able to pay Spell Pierce's cost. So this is very powerful in the early game, and again, usually played in decks where they don't want the game to go very long anyway. But Spell Pierce, pretty cool. I don't really play with it anymore, but there are a lot of people that still swear by Spell Pierce. I think it's perfectly legitimate. Again, most players don't even see it coming, including myself, someone who plays counter spells. So I think it still has a place in specific style decks. Now, Stubborn Denial has a this is one of the most special cards for me in Magic. I have a signed art print of this card. I'm the only one in the world that currently owns an art print of this card, and B, has it signed. So I'm currently the record holder for both. I love Stubborn Denial. I love this card. I really, really do, because when it's played in the right deck, it's so powerful. So let's read it real quick, because I know a lot of you probably haven't played with Stubborn Denial. Counter target non-creature spell unless its control pays 1, and you're paying 1 mana. Alright, so this seems far worse than Spell Pierce, and it is, if you just look at it in a vacuum like that. But it has a ferocious trigger. If you control a creature with power 4 or greater, counter that spell instead. So for 1 mana, for 1 blue, you can counter any non-creature spell in the game. Just a hard counter. That's super, super powerful, especially in a format like Modern, where you don't often have effects like that for 1 blue. This is Stubborn Denial is just awesome. When I'm playing a deck and I'm playing with a bunch of 4+ power creatures, which happens, like for example Temur Delver. I always go back to Temur Delver, playing Tarmogoyf, playing Hooting Mandrills. Hooting Mandrills is always going to be a 4/4. Tarmogoyf is almost always a 4/5 or a 5/6. So Stubborn Denial is almost always going to be cast with the Ferocious trigger, and yeah, that's just the beauty of Stubborn Denial. It's just the beauty of Stubborn Denial. So Ferocious trigger, counter target spell, target non-creature spell, boom, done, 1 blue mana. It's just brutal. Death Shadows decks, Grixis Death Shadow decks, or whatever. Any Death Shadow deck that plays blue almost certainly plays some number of Stubborn Denials, and I don't see why not. They have 5/5, 6/6, 7/7 Death Shadows, and they have a 1 mana counter non-creature spell. So super powerful. I love this card. I could speak about it forever, or I could talk about it forever. Yeah, Stubborn Denial is a charm. Sees very little play. Obviously, it's generally low power. It is a utility counterspell, and by that I mean you have a few options. You don't have to counter with it. You could also have it deal 2 damage to target creature, or draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. So you can loot with it, you can shock a creature, or you can counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2. Some decks play 1 of or something in some Izzet decks, but realistically speaking, you have way better options now. I wanted to bring it up because it does show up here and there, and it is technically an option, but it's also an option that I would say you should ignore and avoid. There's probably something better you can play in Izzet Charm's spot. Negate also used to see quite a bit of sideboard play. Very little in main board play, but definitely a lot of play in the sideboard. You would bring it in against combo decks, or spell-based combo decks at least. You would bring it in potentially against Tron or other control decks. So Negate saw quite a bit of play. Nowadays, it's kind of, again, gone to the sidelines, especially now with Counterspell, let's be honest. But you also have Veil of Summer, which kind of takes up some of the cases where you want to negate in the first place. For example, if you're playing against blue spells. So negates, I'm saying negate a lot, aren't I? Let's count the amount of times I say negate until the end of this video. Its stock has dropped, but it still sees play here and there in the sideboard. I definitely don't think it's a main board card. It has seen main board play in the past, definitely not anymore. Dovin's Veto is just a better negate. If you're playing blue and white, there's absolutely no reason for you to not play Dovin's Veto over negate, unless you're being super conservative with your mana, which you shouldn't be in this instance, because Dovin's Veto can't be countered, so it's just better than negate in every way. It's counter target non-creature spell. So again, if you want to play negate again, but you have access to white as well, don't play it. Play Dovin's Veto. It's just better. Counter Squall, counter target non-creature spell. Its controller loses 2 life. I get really tilted when this card gets played against me. It's very good. It's a negate with also your opponent loses 2 life, which is amazing. If you're playing blue-black, you probably have this in your sideboard, may potentially in your main board. I'm not sure how much main board plays this actually has seen, but definitely seen sideboard play. Yep, that's it. I'm just telling you right now, if you've been playing Counter Squall against me, I get super tilted. I don't know why. It just super tilts me. I'd rather get my card negated than Counter Squall. I think it's that 2 life that just pisses me off. Alright, so let's take a look at some even more specific counter spells. So these spells are not just non-creature, they're like, no, very specific type of spell. It's a spell. Counter target instant spell. This would obviously usually come into play against some combo decks in the past, or against other blue decks. So I guess you could technically bring it against Burn as well, but I don't really see huge utility there. Nowadays, you have better options. Usually doesn't come into play anymore. Again, you would bring this in to protect your spells against other permission decks. Now you have Veil of Summer, which is just better in every way. So the spell stock has dropped to near 0 in my opinion. Still shows up here and there, but not something I would choose. Ceremonies Rejection, on the other hand, is still an awesome card. Counter target colorless spell. This is a counter spell for any Tron deck or artifact deck. It's a 1 mana counter spell because all those decks play colorless spells for the most part. So a 1 mana counter for those decks is just brutal. Trust me, they hate it. I've spoken to Tron players, they hate this card. It's an option for you if you are playing against a lot of artifact decks, or a lot of Tron decks in your meta, or if just the general modern meta is like that. Ceremonies Rejection should be definitely a card you consider putting in your sideboard, because again, it's super powerful. 1 blue is way better than 2 blue in the case of Counterspell, for example, and way better than Mana Leak, obviously. So keep in mind, Ceremonies Rejection is still a card I consider when I think the meta calls for it. Annul, counter target artifact or enchantment spell. This sees some sideboard play as well to deal with combo decks mostly, let's be honest, that are enchantment heavy. I guess you could bring it against artifact decks as well, but it's usually when someone's playing against Annul is because they're worried about enchantments, not so much artifacts, because you have other ways to deal with artifacts usually. So Annul is an option, not a card I personally would want to use to deal with enchantments. I think that's more personal play style, but something you should definitely consider. Invasive Surgery is awesome if you're playing a Delirium deck, and if you're worried about if you're worried about combo decks. So counter target sorcery spell. If there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, search your graveyard, hand, and library for that spell, that spell's controller, of that spell's controller, for any number of cards of the same. Okay, so it's basically a surgical extraction that also counters a spell. Let's put it that way. So you counter the spell, that's a sorcery spell, and then you surgically extract it. That's essentially what you're doing. That's why they call it invasive surgery. It's a reference to surgical extraction. If you're playing a Delirium deck and you're worried about certain types of combo decks, I don't know how good invasive surgery would fit in the current meta. I guess I would have to look at cards like Living End. This would be good against a card like Living End because you would counter it and then get rid of Living End from the deck. So, in which case that your opponent will probably concede because there's no other way to win or no easy way to win. So this might be a card you want to bring in, but keep in mind it's very narrow. So you would have to do a proper survey of the meta and the type of cards you're seeing. And if you think that this would hit enough cards, including your sideboard, because like I said, it's super powerful. If you can get Delirium on before this is cast, it's a great spell. It's a great spell to have because it effectively shuts down the combo deck completely. All right, utility counters, and by utility, this is another reference to Is a Charm, which is also at least what I call a utility card or utility counter spell, because there are cards that counter, and they're often used to counter, but they also have other modes that you can choose if countering is not necessary at the moment, or if you want to counter and do something else at the same time, at least in the case of Cryptic Command. So Archmage's Charm, choose 1 counter target spell, okay, for 3 mana. Obviously way worse than counter spell, but you have 2 other options here. Target player draws 2 cards. Unless something's wrong with you, you're always targeting yourself. Gain control of target non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less, which actually is still very relevant in today's meta. You can steal Death's Shadow and many other 1 CMC creature spells. So Archmage's Charm, if you're playing a devoted control deck where you're going to have access to a lot of blue, Archmage's Charm is pretty powerful to have, pretty good on curve, and again, you have some options. I've seen plenty of players cast this against me and just do it to draw 2 cards, and drawing 2 cards is really powerful when you need it. So I think this is a great card, great card. If your mana base can support 3 blue, go for it. Now, if your mana base can support 3 blue, it can definitely support Cryptic Command, because this is the same cost of Archmage's Charm plus 1 colorless. Way more powerful, in my opinion. Choose 2 counter target spell, which is almost always what it's being used for. Plus, you could return target permanent to a summoner's hand, tap all creatures your opponents control, or draw a card. In all the times I've had Cryptic Command cast against me, which I guarantee you has been hundreds, counter target spell and draw a card is probably the most common combo I've seen. And I've also seen tap all creatures your opponents control and draw a card as the second most common combination. It's just how it is. Super powerful. That's why it's really expensive. But for the decks that can afford it and make games last that long, Cryptic Command is just a no-brainer. You're going to be playing some number of it, if not 4 of. All right. Now for the last batch, I guess you could say, the oddballs, in my opinion, that still see some play here and there, or don't see play anymore. Mana Tithe. It's not blue. It's not even black. It's white, just pure white. I also never see this coming, and I get super tilted when I see this card, because any deck that's playing Mana Tithe is being, that your opponent is being a jerk. Okay, I'm going to keep this PG. Your opponent's being a jerk. They're probably doing something that's very annoying, and it's probably some prison style deck, and they're going to chalice you next turn or something like that. It's just super frustrating. Very few fair decks play Mana Tithe. it is what it is. It is counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. You see white producing land, and you never assume Mana Tithe is going to come down. Boom. Your first play, or even your second turn play, is countered, and you just get super tilted. So Mana Tithe is an option, I guess, if you're playing white. But if you're playing white, what the hell are you doing watching this video? Drown in the Loch. So choose one. Counter target spell with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of cards in control's graveyard. Destroy target creature with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of cards in control's graveyard. I very much have a love-hate relationship with Drown in the Loch. Mostly because, again, it's super dependent on the amount of cards in your opponent's graveyard, and you'd be surprised how often it's dead in your hand when you really need it, and it's super frustrating. So, if you're going to play Drown in the Loch in your deck, make sure you're milling your opponent sufficiently enough to be able to take out the spells that you need when you need to. Because if not, you're going to be kicking yourself with this dead card in your hand while your opponent casts a spell and gets away with it. So just keep that in mind. It's also nice to be able to remove a creature, sure, but again, it's hyper dependent on your opponent's graveyard. So if your opponent is not playing a very interactive deck on their end, they're not going to have many cards in their graveyard, and this card is going to be very bad. And it often sees main board play, which means there's some number of matches where this card is just dead. So just keep that in mind. A lot of people still play with it, so I must be wrong, and they must all be enjoying it. Of the times I have played with Drown in the Loch, I just wish I never put it in the deck. It's just my personal experience. Fluster Storm doesn't see that much play. It might see a resurgence if Storm, I guess, becomes super oppressive. It does catch your opponents off guard. So counter target instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays 1, and it has Storm. So if your opponent casts a bunch of spells and then they cast their payoff spell, you could cast Fluster Storm, and you can keep targeting the same spell over and over and over again if you really wanted to. And all of a sudden they have to pay a bunch of mana that they don't have anymore. And if this Fluster Storm effectively counts as just a 1 mana counter spell. So it has its uses. I haven't yet found a reason to play it in a sideboard, but it's always an option, and it is actually legal in Modern. So keep that in mind. Aethergust. I love the art. I love the colors used in the art. I love the foiling of this card. I can't bring myself to play with this card. I don't like narrow spells like this in general, narrow permission spells, and this isn't even technically a counter, but it kind of is. So choose target spell or permanent that's red or green. Its owner puts it on the top or the bottom of their library, so the opponent chooses where it goes. It has to be red or green spell or permanent. Even when Pawns and decks were running rampant in the meta, I still refuse to play with this card. I just don't like it because it's dead and everywhere else, and it's taking up space on my sideboard. I'd rather deal with Pawns and decks my own way. That being said, I'm probably wrong because a lot of people still play with it. So if the masses are playing with it, I just assume I'm the wrong one. I still wouldn't play with this in my sideboard. I can't stand cards like this. Flash Freeze is something very similar. At least this one counters the spell, as opposed to returning it to the top or the bottom of your opponent's library. It did see some play in the past before Aethergust was printed. Nowadays, I don't think I see Flash Freeze anymore, except in some fringe decks, but it is technically an option if you're really worried about red or green decks. Flash Freeze is a nice way to hard counter their spells and really piss off your opponents, like super piss off your opponents, because yeah, you're just going to piss them off. So I guess if you want to do that, this would be a nice sideboard card to play if you think it's necessary. And that's it. This went on for almost 40 minutes. I did not expect to talk that much, but there are a lot of permission spells in Modern, and there's way more, obviously, in all of Magic. But these are the ones that see play right now in Modern, or have seen recent play in the past in Modern, that have some sort of impact. I hope this was really useful to you. I'd really love to know in the comment section down below if you thought it was. Let me know if I missed anything. Obviously, I didn't include creatures that counter spells. If you notice that, there was none here. So I didn't put Curse Catcher or anything like that. There are a couple of fairies that also counter spells. Mistcutter Sprite. I don't remember the name exactly. I didn't include them on purpose just because A, they don't see that much play, and B, I just wanted to focus on permission spells, non-creature spells in general. But let me know in the comment section down below what you think about these spells, any other spells you think I should have brought up. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. Enjoy my content in general, please subscribe, hit notification bell. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, share my content on social media. Watch my content start to finish like you are right now. All of that really helps me out a lot. Like I said, check out Patreon, check out the Patreon rewards. my Patreon is really there to make most of your money back. I'm not kidding. So check out the Patreon video if you want to learn more. The longer you're a patron, the more you get back in terms of rewards, and eventually you'll make more than what you put in. Check it out. Thanks, and have a good one.